Few ideas polarize like socialism, a controversial word whose very controversy reflects the complexities of social systems and what they entail, as not mere abstractions, but society's ideological direction and its material consequences. While society tends to favor the aesthetics of academia and reduce important topics down to the limitations and biases of impartial debate, the real impact is felt by individuals and their communities, the real winners and losers. With a natural inclination to compromise, it's essential to recognize the power of coercion and its ripple effect on society, as Ryan fails to do himself. Physiologically speaking, the fundamental core of existence is survival, but this conditional response is as primitive as it is imperfect. Life, for many, is an active survival situation, whether hunting for food or toiling at the workplace to acquire it. In these circumstances, authenticity becomes a rarity as individuals navigate the societal expectations imposed upon them. Our intrinsic biases and intricate social dynamics can lead us to act against our own self-interests, especially for those who are marginalized and exploited. Attempting to force ideologically diverse ideas together, then, risks forming a disjointed collective, rather than a unifying force aligned with reality. Debates on socioeconomic systems, then, should focus on the quality of life, their outcomes, and how those outcomes align with the desires of the people. Regardless of one's stance on socialism, and while Ryan Chapman and I would agree that few ideas polarize like it, his attempt to answer what socialism is, with the seemingly impartial and noble goal of encompassing everyone of the modern era, inadvertently harms socialists, which will become more apparent as we dive into his video, Socialism, an in-depth explanation. This video is sponsored by Buy Me a Coffee, or at least mine I should say, a simple and easier alternative to Patreon. If at any point you find enough enjoyment and have the ability, consider if the work I do in producing class-conscious educational content is worth a few dollars or more, and in the spirit of praxis, help expose the channel to more people by pleasing the algorithm, when you like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Now back to the video.
Socialism. Many would say that the answer is simple, and they'd open a dictionary and read a definition about socialism being the government owning the means of production and directing the economy. That's definitely a significant understanding of socialism, but the problem is it's tied to a certain era, and many, if not most of modern socialists don't go by it. So we're going to need something broader.
Though not saying much, Ryan Chapman is in first place in terms of when I must inevitably interrupt from the start of his video. With that said, however, if socialism really is when the government does stuff, and that definition is not broad enough, then I believe the essence of the word has already been lost. Without specifying local relevance, it's crucial to recognize the diverse ideas within socialism, including those who advocate for progressive command economies and proletarian state control of the means of production to this day. From Denges patiently awaiting Chinese socialism, to Leninists who seek to pick up where the Cybersyn project left off, and the various socialists in between that just want a humble imperialist welfare state, all of those are modern and sizable examples of socialism. No need to agree with anyone, just with the importance of including even the scariest of mentions, allowing viewers to decide for themselves which forms of socialism are and aren't preferable.
But then if you ask those socialists what they think socialism is, their answer is often unusably broad, like saying socialism is the hope for human freedom and justice under the unprecedented conditions of life that humanity will face in the 21st century. So by that, pretty much anyone can be a socialist.
If those socialists refer to the earlier definition about socialism being the government owning the means of production and directing the economy, then why is it now hope for human freedom and justice? And who actually uses this definition unironically anyway? I have not been liking this representation of various socialists so far.
This is the point where people usually do a lot of henrying about how difficult it is to nail down a specific conception of socialism. I frankly don't think it's that bad. I think the best way to do this is to go through socialism chronologically, show where the ideas came from, where they converged, and where they split, and where that leaves us today. So most of this video is basically going to be a history of socialist thought.
If people can't even agree on a specific conception of socialism, then my skepticism is elevated that one definition could cover them all. But let's give this intriguing goal of his the benefit of the doubt anyway.
I think it'll help to start with some general comments. The first thing to say is that socialism as a political tradition emerged as a reaction against liberalism, specifically as a reaction against the Industrial Revolution. As liberalism grew in popularity and in influence, socialism grew along with it. Liberalism can be understood as the political philosophy where individuals are held to be ends in themselves, Liberals want to create a political order where people can develop into whoever they want to be. They can think whatever they want to think, believe whatever they want to believe, and pursue whatever they want to pursue. Liberals primarily achieve that through law, notably by granting people rights. Those rights are designed to keep people from suppressing each other's individuality. Liberalism expressed as an economic philosophy is capitalism. So that's when you have property rights backed by law, and at least theoretically, a free market where people are free to exchange goods and services with others. In a liberal order, hierarchies naturally develop, and socialists traditionally concern themselves with negative effects related to those hierarchies.
Everything was going well until the end there because liberalism is more of an ideology of capitalism, and I don't mean that liberally. Much like how neoconservatives, anarcho-capitalists, and fascists all have their own idea for how capitalism should take form. Like a true centrist, it isn't just the left Ryan is glossing over either. Moreover, acknowledging those who are operating within power structures like the liberal state apparatus is very devaluing and dismissive of the revolutionary origins of socialism, including those he will discuss later. It's also disrespectful to the millions of oppressed and class-conscious anarchists, communists, and socialists who were traditionally concerning themselves with many great experiments, each anxiously sacrificing themselves to empower us with the knowledge we have today.
Liberals are traditionally concerned with concentrations of political power. So they don't want a king to have all the power, they don't want a minority to have all the power, and they don't want a majority to have all the power. So they want power broken up across society. Socialists are traditionally concerned with concentrations of economic power, typically the power that the rich are thought to hold over the poor. So socialists typically want their own checks and balances against concentrations of economic power.
Considering that everything is politics, and most of us use terms like socioeconomics, with all due respect, differentiating politics and economics makes zero sense and seems to be a dichotomy of someone operating under the liberal framework themselves. Secondly, despite edging us on with promises of its history, only liberally confined socialists get represented here. This isn't to say that desiring change within the current system is bad, but what is bad is putting the faith of the common people on the sole investment of one of the slowest strategies. All progress is progress, sure, but checks and balances against concentrations of economic power is concerningly bureaucratic and a concern of oligarchs and politicians, not most people, who already know and are maybe desensitized to many flawed examples of checks and balances in practice, well aware of the plentiful corruption that exists alongside capitalism's dominating profit motive. After acknowledging the various interpretations of egalitarianism and equal opportunity that I agree socialists have historically aspired for, he says,
Socialists tend to be motivated by a sense of injustice. They tend to look to the worst off, the needy, the sick, the unfortunate, or the oppressed, and claim that their circumstances are unnecessary and even unfair.
I know it might sound pedantic, but compassion and progress aren't inherently socialist. Not all capitalists secretly wish for the worst version of capitalism. Philanthropy, the act of fruitlessly throwing money at problems more or less, is a prime example of compassion under capitalism. Compassion and progress are the very forces that brought us to where we are in our socioeconomic development. They led us to capitalism, and they can lead us out of it.
People typically point to three founding influences of socialism: Saint-Simon, Charles Fourier, and Robert Owen. What they all had in common was a sense of the inadequacy of unadulterated liberalism, which is to say, unregulated capitalism. They didn't call themselves socialists because the word socialism wasn't around yet, but you can see something recognizably socialist in their work.
Here we can see Ryan Chapman is proving my point. Was it not considered socialist because the term didn't already exist, or because it's just dissatisfaction with so-called unregulated capitalism like he says? As if many of the problems we face today aren't direct problems of capitalism itself. Like when free market libertarians advocate a reset to small businesses. My hypothetical brother in Christ, where do you think the corporations we despise nowadays came from? Now brace yourself for a lengthy clip from Ryan Chapman, as the duration itself makes a point, and what he deems necessary for the conclusions he gets to later.
Saint-Simon looked around 18th century France. He said, "Here is an idea that seems right to me. The first needs of life are the most urgent ones. Those without property can only satisfy them in an incomplete manner. A physiologist sees clearly that their most constant desire should be that of lowering their taxes or increasing in their pay, which amounts to the same thing." Saint-Simon called for the creation of a new Christianity, founded on the principle that all men must behave as brothers toward one another, and whose overall goal was the most rapid possible amelioration of the condition of the poorest class. He also advocated for collectively agreeing on rewarding those who succeed in doing works of general utility. For example, by rewarding the artists who fill the gaps in your busy life with the pleasures which are best suited to develop your intelligence. In other words, he's saying that if we let things freely develop, negative side effects come along with that, and he's arguing that we should instead intentionally shape things according to our values. Going forward, that's going to be a running theme in socialism. Charles Fourier looked at capitalist societies and argued that they weren't organized efficiently. He thought immense advantages would result if people were brought together to work communally. He said, why are there 300 wineries competing against each other, most of them in disrepair, when there could be one great winery? Why would 100 milkmaids go to the neighboring city to get 100 jugs of milk, when one milkmaid could go get a barrel of milk for everybody? So if we did these things collectively, according to Fourier, they wouldn't be so wasteful. Fourier also thought that capitalist societies had unnecessarily depressing work lives, and he thought we could reorganize our work lives in a way that would make people more passionate. For example, you could divide people up into teams and have them compete against each other for honors, or rotate jobs throughout the day so no one has to work for more than a couple hours in any role. He thought you didn't have to force people to do this stuff. If a few intentional communities first set an example, he thought others would follow. They would be brought together by a lure of gain and pleasures, as he put it. If a unified society produced 3 times as much as an atomized society, people would be incentivized to unify. Robert Owen had a theory that people were products of their environment. And as such, he thought we should use our resources to make people better, make them happier, make them kinder, better mannered, and more productive. He thought the best place to do that would be through education when people are young and impressionable, and he specifically saw the government as a means to that end. Owen thought governments should establish rational plans for the education and general formation of the characters of their subjects, focusing on forming their character in childhood, which he thought would prevent bad habits from forming, like lying or wanting to hurt others, and he thought it would promote good habits, like wanting to help others. This is essentially a reaction against the individualism of liberalism. So liberals tend to think that if you're doing well in life, or if you're doing badly in life, it's your own fault. And here he's flipping that. He's saying it's not necessarily the individual's fault, but rather it's the fault of the environment. Owen thought that this explained the squalid conditions of the poor, saying, "Shall the well-being of millions of the poor, half naked, half famished, untaught and untrained, daily increasing to a most alarming extent in these islands, not call forth one petition, one delegate, or one rational effective legislative measure? No, for such has been our education." Owen also believed that happy employees are more productive. He set up a community that paid unusually high wages, that also had pleasant working conditions, and had comfortable homes for the workers. These are just a few of their arguments that shaped socialism going forward. Looked at more fully, none of them were properly socialists, as we understand the word now. For example, when Saint-Simon imagined himself addressing the working class, he wrote, "We are 10 times, 20 times, 100 times more numerous than the possessors, and yet the possessors wield over us a domination far greater than any power we have over them." Then he says, "I realize, my friends, how entirely frustrated you are, but note that the possessors, although inferior in number, possess more enlightenment than you, and that for the general good, domination must be distributed according to the share of intelligence. Look at what happened in France while your comrades were dominant there. They produced a famine." I think this illustrates that we have since then established a definitive idea of what is and is not socialist. So you should be able to look at what Saint-Simon said and see exactly where it jumped ship and isn't socialist anymore.
Should I be able to tell what is and isn't socialist from any of that? Let alone Simon's emphasis on society producing problems over blaming the individual, because I didn't leave anything out, as much as I wanted to for just how much and how unnecessary it all was to the overall video. My initial impression upon hearing about Owen's enlightening the masses led me to believe there would be a discussion about the Enlightenment period in general, and maybe, if we're lucky, Antonio Gramsci's differentiation between organic and traditional intellectuals. Honestly, I still don't know what this entire section was supposed to be about, as the historical context provided doesn't seem to align with later conclusions.
The socialist conception of equalitarianism means that socialists want to mitigate hierarchies. They probably don't want to frame them as being natural, and they especially don't want to frame them as being for the greater good.
So in summary, we are trying to figure out an inclusive definition of socialism, yet in practice, have reduced it to any activity deemed morally accepted as better than previous capitalist forms, and that while any organization can and should be multifaceted in its efforts to achieve progress, surely civil rights wouldn't have gotten as far or be taken as seriously without the violent motivators against the state. Another example being the right to unionize, which only came after the Cold Wars from 1890 to 1930, preventable bloodshed by the unprecedented response to the American bourgeoisie. Other rights have similar origins, like the right to insurance to compensate for the lack of adequate healthcare, and even the concept of social security, for instance. More filler content later, and Ryan finally reaches the bulk of his critiques with the introduction of egalitarian philosopher Gratien Babeuf and revolutionary figure Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who Babeuf credited while pushing for what Ryan described as
simply implementing Rousseau's theories. Babeuf came forward and wanted the revolutionaries to take the word equality much more seriously. He wanted their new society to settle for nothing less than perfect class equality. He wanted for all individuals, without distinction, an absolutely equal portion of all the goods. Since men are absolutely equal, Babeuf wrote, they must not have any private possessions, but must enjoy everything in common, so that no one can, by the mere fact of birth, be either more or less rich, or be considered less worthy than any of those around him, which makes Babeuf arguably the founder of modern communism.
Calling Babeuf the founder of modern communism for wanting those things is an argument I would expect to hear from someone who knows nothing about socialism, but quotes Reagan on understanding the Communist Manifesto over the Marxists who read it anyway. Babeuf might be advocating for absolute uniformity between people and possessions, but modern communism is about socially enforcing equal opportunity through the elimination of class. Not because they have wealth in the first place, and the workers are jealous, or so that everyone can be the same in contrast to stark economic disparities, but because the class that holds wealth in one have restrained its distribution to inheritance, allowing for the creation of greedy, inconsiderate, and ignorant elites to carry on the mantle of telling workers to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and the homeless to just get a job. Inheritance that persists under capitalism regardless of the flavor of its intentions. Consider me very disappointed then, in having to correct the guy who also made a long video on Marxism.
Babeuf also brought a revolutionary ideology to socialism, which means you want a sudden, thorough transformation of society, typically by seizing power. Babeuf and his associates plotted to take over the revolution and lead it themselves, making them the first to imagine revolution as a calculated process, directed by a vanguard of conspirators whose goals might be unknown to the mass of their followers. This might be reminding you of a later socialist who would actually successfully do that, and who we'll get to. Babeuf's plot was discovered by the revolutionaries. They weren't in a forgiving mood, so that was the end of Babeuf. But he would live on as an influence for communists who would emerge after him in Europe. This is Babeuf being referenced in the Communist Manifesto.
Since I've delved into Babeuf myself for one of the leftist icebergs I made, that y'all should check out after this by the way, I'm well aware that Ryan references the conspiracy of equals and paints Babeuf as an ill-intending opportunist. After the First French Republic's formation, it went out of its way to undo the distribution of food from agreeable prices in 1796, which angered the working class and was something Babeuf sympathized with, and likewise attempted with 7 conspirators to coup the new French government. So it isn't like Lenin, Leninism, and the Bolshevik Revolution, but I'll get to that when he does. Let's just hope the conspiracy of equals isn't being mentioned now, for the sake of building up to incorrect criticisms about Leninism later. Additionally, the most ridiculous argument yet by Mr. Chapman is using Babeuf being mentioned in the Communist Manifesto as what? Some sort of proof that he founded communism? The passage merely acknowledges how Babeuf listened to the working class and nothing more than that. How is this creator taken seriously? Because he can create the illusion of high-quality academia content?
The term socialism was coined by the followers of Robert Owen in the 1820s. As capitalism developed through the early to mid-1800s, it became increasingly industrialized, and with that, class distinctions sharpened. A self-conscious industrial working class began to take shape in England and Western Europe. New types of socialists emerged that framed their theories through class conflict, the socioeconomic haves against the socioeconomic have-nots, and they specifically saw the have-nots as being the industrial working class, who they called the proletariat. But these socialists tended to be middle class.
Despite my interest in red flags, it's a big and unfavorable red flag for anyone discussing socioeconomics to unjustifiably push the notion of a middle class. Sure, there was the middling culture of the 14th and 15th centuries that involved labor aristocratic-like professionals, from playwrights to craftsmen, but the idea of the middle class did not exist until 1913 by a statistician, and has never been properly defined without absurd amounts of other statistics contingent on each other to seem legit. Before the global pandemic interfered with things, 52% of US adults lived in middle-income households in 2018. Yet another statistic of the same year claims that almost 80% of US workers lived paycheck to paycheck. Somehow less than half of 20% of people, the remainder of which includes the upper class as well, are supposed to be middle class. Of all these statistics, one of them is lying, and I don't think it's the one measuring people's living standards while the other is about an arbitrary concept no one can seem to agree on.
In the mid-1800s, one figure rose up and dominated socialism with his ideas, easily becoming the biggest figure in the tradition. And that, of course, is Karl Marx. Marx came from a philosophical tradition of system building, which was popular up until his time, but isn't really done anymore. So system building is when you make an elaborate, self-contained body of work that tries to explain just about everything. As Bertrand Russell put it, Marx was the last of the great system builders. I think this brought an intellectual grandiosity to socialism that hasn't been matched since. There were all these separate socialist ideas floating around at the time that had mostly come from France and England. And what Marx did was to combine them together with a German philosophy popular in his time, which was the philosophy of Georg Hegel.
Right. All the other mentions of proto-socialists form the basis of Marx's theory. He just took them all, put it together, and gave it an intellectual bow tie, even though Marx was the one to denounce traditionally intellectual Georg Hegel in college. Another thing Ryan bastardizes is the part about the system building itself, followed by the unnecessary distraction that is the runoff about cats, Plato, and Aristotle. None of that matters, since he's generalizing all of these idealistic philosophical frameworks that concern themselves with immaterial fascinations. To Marx taken inspiration from Hegel's own philosophical framework, who synthesized the concept of system building itself under a material framework Marxists call dialectical materialism. Just because too many oversimplify Hegel's ideas on thesis and synthesis doesn't mean Marxist dialectics is the same for also being about cause and effect and social dynamics in general. I know a lot was skipped to get to his point, but just go watch his after this. I promise it's all de-radicalizing jargon coated in glamour.
Marx, like Hegel, believed that history was progressive, and he believed that class conflict drove that historical progression. The material conditions create capitalism, and from there you have the way we think, our culture, our law, politics, society. So as material conditions change, society changes along with them. Unlike Adam Smith, who saw capitalism as bringing people together into voluntary and mutually beneficial relationships.
Did he though? Because under Ryan's own considerations of what constitutes a proto-socialist, it's actually a common socialist narrative to see Adam Smith as exactly that. Uncommon is it to know that Adam Smith despised the concept and relationship of landlord and tenant. Rare is it to understand that Smith observed and criticized divisions of labor under even his own experiences of capitalism, which he considered a source of estrangement and suffering, and I quote, "In the progress of the division of labor, the employment of the far greater part of those who live by labor, the great body of the people, comes to be confined to a very few simple operations, frequently that of one class to two. The man whose whole life is spent in performing a few simple operations, of which the effects are always the same, has no occasion to exert his understanding or to exercise his invention in finding out expedients for removing difficulties which never occur. He naturally loses the habit of such exertion, and becomes as stupid and ignorant as possible for a human to become. This great body above the people must fail unless the government takes some pains to prevent this." This alone is enough to show that Adam Smith was not the founder of capitalism as many see him to be, but perhaps the founder of capitalism's critiques. Ryan's next gigantic error is associating the idea of pursuing some sort of grand narrative with Marx's advocacy of communism. That is why he is giving this historical context to build up to this, that he says later.
Marx didn't leave his feelings about these things up for interpretation. He thought the right to own private property gave the bourgeoisie supreme political power in capitalist societies, making them the ruling class. What we would normally call liberal society, to him, was bourgeois society. So he thought the law, morality, and religion coming from capitalist societies reflected bourgeois prejudices and bourgeois interests. It's not clear how aware Marx was of the implications of this next part, but he crucially took an idea of Hegel's and applied it to his theory. And that's Hegel's idea that due to a hidden, undeveloped essence, human societies had a law of historical development. Like Hegel, he believed society was inexorably moving towards an increasing perfection. And also like Hegel, this was both an ethical and a logical perfection. He said, if the conflict hinges on the right to own private property, and if the people without property far outnumber the people with property, then the solution is for the propertyless masses to realize their common oppression, then to band together, rise up, seize power, and implement a new society, a communist society, where the right to own private property is abolished, which he thought would finally break the historical saga of class conflict by being the first society without class conflict. As he wrote in his 20s, communism is the riddle of history solved, and it knows itself to be this solution. As Marx got older, he toned down that kind of mystical talk, but his historicist conviction and his support for communism remained. The fall of capitalism and the rise of communism, he maintained, was inevitable. This is an end of history kind of argument. He's saying that capitalism is the last form of society to feature class conflict, and that communism will be the first society without class conflict, which will bring on a new era of history. So everything up until that, to Marx, is prehistory.
Here is the pattern I've noticed with Ryan Chapman. Set up the viewer with the proposition, the goal of understanding socialism, and fill everyone's head with unnecessary history that doesn't actually help in achieving said proposition. Now we're getting it again. Only this time I've spared you all from having to sit through all that build-up. Like strawman arguments and the reason they are called that, all of this framing of history with facts changes the narrative away from accurately representing socialists. Now we're supposed to think the guy who made a supposedly thorough video on Marxism really believes Marx and Engels were just some idealists who didn't denounce such things in socialism, utopian, and scientific. Wouldn't be surprised if the entire purpose of the video was secretly just a show for a specific type of socialism and nothing else. Oh wait.
In the last decade of the 19th century, ominous contradictions to Marxism began to appear. Capitalism was reforming and becoming gentler. Misery wasn't increasing, it seemed to be shrinking. Wealth was spreading across all classes of society, and the working class didn't seem to be turning towards communism. Marxists were faced with a choice: stick with the position that Marx was right, which was the orthodox Marxist position, or say that, at least in some aspects, he was wrong, which implies diversifying your sources of belief. The person who came to embody the latter position was a man named Eduard Bernstein.
You all don't understand, you see. Between Marx's death in 1883 to 1899, barely 2 decades, the wealth trickled down so abundantly by the generous likes of the bourgeoisie, who changed on a whim. The spread of Marxism during this time was not at all worrying to them after his death, nor did Lenin feel the need to address at the start of state and revolution the fact that the bourgeoisie couldn't stop making active efforts to devalue Marx with liberal portrayals as Ryan is doing now. So maybe the capitalists loosened up a little, made the breadcrumbs bigger so the current generation of workers feel listened to for a while, and soon forget the reason Karl Marx wrote Das Kapital in the first place. Because honestly, I'm not against reformism, but I am against reformists that think there needs to be a war against other socialists, and deprive them from making decisions themselves. It isn't like there weren't already considerations of gaining reparations to the state apparatus already, as Chapman also mentions. Marx and Engels were harsh critics of bureaucracies as noted in their rebuttals against proto-Bolsheviks Peter Tikhachev and Sergei Nechayev, both of whom advocated for a state that provided welfare for the proletariat in the name of the proletariat. But the cherry on top of this would be apparent to Ryan Chapman had he finished one of his first sources, Socialist Thought: A Documentary History, that references Marx's thesis on Feuerbach, which criticized Paris commune counter-revolutionaries who only wanted to benefit a category of people much like capitalism does, and even references the aforementioned socialism utopian and scientific. Ryan Chapman, what are you doing?
Bernstein was a highly regarded Marxist. He was mentored by Marx's collaborator, Friedrich Engels. He was even asked by Engels to produce a new volume of Capital based on Marx's notes. But as time went on, these trends troubled Bernstein, and they reached a point where he couldn't reconcile them with his commitment to Marx anymore. He wrote a book called Evolutionary Socialism as an extended critique on Marx that brought about a split in socialism that still remains to this day.
It makes sense that Ryan would find familiarity in the works of Eduard Bernstein, as both of them prefer not to give out all of the information about Marxism, who could have been less generalizing and biased in their representations of socialism, like Bernstein's refusal to complete Marx's work and let people judge it for themselves, instead insisting that they know what socialism is all about and what the needs of the people truly are.
Marxists at the time gave Bernstein's views a name: revisionism. To show that the historical trend that Marx predicted wasn't occurring, Bernstein checked certain statements in Capital against modern evidence like tax receipts, and concludes that it is quite wrong to assume that the present development of society shows a relative or indeed absolute diminution of the number of the members of the possessing classes. Their number increases both relatively and absolutely. If you just looked at what was happening in society, he argued, improvement was unmistakable. Society was transforming in a humane direction, which signifies not hopelessness, but capability of improvement in the condition of the worker. He said it is not only useless, it is the greatest folly to attempt to conceal this from ourselves.
The earlier insinuations about Bernstein thinking capitalism had proven itself capable of meeting the needs of the proletariat, whether that is even true or not, matters not, because it would be ridiculous to think considerations of even moderate socialists were reasonable to the bourgeois state, when he was exiled from Germany for 20 years followed by a swath of anti-socialist laws. Not to minimize the little things, but what significant progress was really made during Eduard Bernstein's lifetime? He died in the 30s at the height of fascism, for crying out loud. If Ryan should know anything about fascism, it's a metaphorical expression of decaying capitalism, as was the global economic depression that infected the world a decade prior. And if anyone is still skeptical of fascism being a decadent capitalist ideology, look up the origins of the word privatization, or check out my video that covers a variety of fascist interpretations of America after this one.
He also broke from Marx as a theorist, for example by saying that his framing wasn't pluralistic. It doesn't make sense to speak of workers as a homogeneous mass. And he criticized traditional socialist goals. He called the experiments that had been done with collective societies until then sad experiences that were causing people in socialist circles to turn their backs more and more on the whole cooperative movement. He even called central planning absurd. He calculated how much work it might take for a government to direct an economy in an advanced European country and concluded, what abundance of judgment, practical knowledge, talent for administration must a government or a national assembly have at its disposal to be even equal to the supreme management or managing control of such a gigantic organism.
Ryan wants to insert the middle class into history under the guise of appearing nuanced and considerate of working class differences so badly, but the reality is that what he said about Marx's assessment of the haves and have-nots is better understood when you realize Marx and Engels refer to the haves as the means of production, private and intellectual property, and more broadly the capital. Small business owners are still business owners, even after working alongside the ones they exploit. Workers with invested retirement plans are still workers, not to mention the fact that they are often severely penalized for using it early and only getting to enjoy it at concerningly high retirement ages compared to the average age of death. But I digress. Plenty of socialists consider celebrity entertainers the term labor aristocrat to refer to those without any means but are often overpaid, exploited, and commodified by managers and record labels. And even workers that resort to surviving and thriving off of criminal activity are considered lumpen proletariat. Try again, Mr. Chapman.
The gradualist argument, if you think about it, breaks orthodox Marxism. If workers are making improvements in their lives through gradual reforms, then they're becoming less miserable. They now have something to lose besides their chains. So why would they risk their lives in a sudden and probably violent revolution if they could improve their lives peacefully and democratically by working within the system? So the further we move towards reformism, the further away we move from Marx's prediction, strictly understood.
While it is definitely true that a worker can feel temporarily satisfied by a state's providence, history has actually proven to us that capitalists are inclined to fight first and compromise second. History has also shown that compromises almost always compromise the working class. People protest in the streets and riot because voting and petitions do very little, while the former are the messages of the unheard, to paraphrase Martin Luther King Jr. Pick any marginalized group in the United States. Black people? Right. So we Americans take them from Africa and commodify them into slaves. Civil revolts and the creation of the police institution to round up all the escapees later, and you get the Civil War. Finally, it's illegal to be a slave and all slaves are free. But what wasn't in the fine print was the fact that the all too similar white men in charge, including the Dixiecrats and Confederate widows, who worked hard to return a sense of pre-Dixie times, led to more violence, Malcolm X, the Black Panthers, even Martin Luther King Jr., who didn't shy away from violence if peaceful protests were treated violently. Segregation ends only for so many of our citizens to be gunned down by the very reasons the Black Panther Party wanted the restructuring of police from the ground up, why Reagan banned open carry firearms to stop community policing from being more effective than cops, and even after the death of Floyd that reignited this historical repetition, there are still millions of unheard criticisms souring into agitation. Do the same for the history of women and LGBT and the disabled. Maybe the only middle-class person here is Ryan Chapman, because he does seem quite separated from the working class and the bourgeoisie. Obviously, advocating for a revolution does nothing if the conditions for it aren't there, so people can do things to help make those conditions more possible in the meantime. But in a world where our planet may very well face permanent changes as a consequence of our rulers' actions, God forbid the working class at least hear and learn about possible alternatives beyond such a depressing and devastating status quo.
This led to a split that was framed as a question within Marxism: reform or revolution. Reformists more or less went with Bernstein, and revolutionists stuck with the orthodox position. Rosa Luxemburg distinguished herself by publishing a popular pamphlet affirming the revolutionary position. The head of the German Socialist Party, Karl Kautsky, also reaffirmed the orthodox Marxist position over and over. But reformism seemed to be the winning argument in the long term. Within about 20 years, most socialists in the party moved over to Bernstein's camp.
Within about 20 years, most socialists in the party moved over to concentration camps, not Bernstein's camp. What a convenient missed opportunity for Ryan to gloss over a few decades that had a crucial part in revolutionary socialist history. The very reason the Soviets were convinced that socialism would arise in Germany first before Russia. This historical revisionism is particularly disgusting for Ryan once he realized what happened in those years. The Social Democratic Party of Germany, or SPD, experienced a split into a few socialist groups, including the SPD, but also the Spartacus League among others. Some of these groups merged into the Spartacus League, but there were plenty more that didn't, and an entire group of disorganized workers that took over factories and fought with authorities in between. Being a threat to the Social Democrats' newly established power and unwilling to compromise with the revolutionaries, they waged a propaganda campaign and called any socialist or socialist activity Spartacus, like it was a slur rather than one of many separate organizations. They also found a common ally who hated the socialists as much as them, if not more: the openly fascistic, anti-Semitic paramilitary known as the Freikorps. They beat workers to death, used flamethrowers, and loved to make graphic examples out of socialists, including social democrats, a part of the SPD when they could get away with it. The more victorious they were, the more funded and supplied they were by the government, until there was no opposition left but the SPD themselves. The Freikorps considered the SPD useful idiots and violently took over, and made reforms that enabled the powers Hitler used to create the Third Reich. who made no hesitation nor distinction to persecute social democrats and revolutionary socialists alike. Oh, and Rosa Luxemburg was arrested by the SPD before the Freikorps took over. The vehicle taken or stopped, and members of the Freikorps, at the alleged orders of the head government, lynched and shot her while still under arrest and defenseless on her way to what she thought was going to be a fair trial and imprisonment. Just thought I should mention that.
The last major development in socialism came from Vladimir Lenin. I think Lenin's contribution to socialism can be mainly understood in two phrases, neither of which he said, but both I think summarize his philosophy well. The first is that the revolution must happen. Socialism must be implemented by any means necessary. Lenin was both committed and creative. He believed in throwing himself into a problem and figuring things out as he went, something captured in a Napoleonic maxim that Lenin was fond of saying. He was also a devout Marxist who treated Marx's writing like scripture. Like Marx, Lenin was also a historicist. He was driven by an absolute faith in his own historical destiny. The destiny of leading a Marxist revolution. Lenin was convinced that he would be the one to wield the conductor's baton, as he put it.
The last major development of socialism, though I think Ryan meant Marxism, was in 1924 at the death of Lenin, as according to Ryan. No Marxist would agree with this. Not the Maoists and the refined theories and extensions of Marxism-Leninism. Not the postmodernists who synthesized Freudian psychoanalysis with dialectical materialism. Not the Marxists who came up with communization theory as a counter to what they considered the failures of Leninism. Albert Einstein's Why Socialism, Paul Cockshott's economic formulas, or even Mark Fisher's modern observations of alienation. Then Ryan Chapman throws us off with a pretty odd and unnecessary claim, to suggest that Marx, or Lenin, or any of these socialists desired idealistic prophecy, is to dismiss the severe stress such Marxists went through in navigating their social, political, and geopolitical situations, which comes from someone not the most fond of Leninism themselves.
They also called themselves internationalists, but then leaned into nationalism once they realized its psychological power. The Bolsheviks also made themselves out as the party of peace, something that made them popular among Russian soldiers at the time. But then shortly after coming into power, were embroiled in a civil war, as well as wars with Ukraine, Armenia, and Georgia, as they all tried to separate from the Soviet Union, and also a war with Poland. To give one more example, the Bolsheviks allowed an election once they came into power. When that election refuted them, they dissolved the Constituent Assembly, ending democracy in the Soviet Union.
What has to be the most blatant misinformation yet is the idea that the Bolsheviks ever considered nationalism. Sure, it's obvious to argue that the Soviet Union did lean into the role of a nation-state after the Second World War, and especially with the death of Stalin, but there is a reason why Mikhail Rodionov was asked to die after producing a flag that embraced bourgeois nationalism instead of a patriotic proletarianism, and a better discussion would have been how the embracement of proletarian empowerment did end up becoming a sort of class fetishism that hindered its ability to abolish itself altogether. This is demonstrated by the great economic disparity felt across the post-Soviet world when neoliberal framers found it appropriate to expose the post-Soviet working class to an entirely new and massively alienated superstructure that didn't just destroy all savings in place of a different currency and economic system, but the spirits of several generations to this day. It's also just plain historically inaccurate that immediate peace was ever a promise of the Bolsheviks. Conflict was actually expected. The very reason they sought to eliminate the Tsar's royal family down to the last heir was a geopolitical move to let foreign onlookers know that the monarchy was dead, that there was no one to recognize but the vanguard, and that the capitalists of the world were next. Agree or disagree with his ideas and the outcomes, I'm just here to say it like it is. Nor were the remnants of the White Army fully defeated after the establishment of the RSFSR, who were still reinforced by bourgeois allies worried over the consequences of a legitimized ideology that could gain the sight of the working class where the capitalist state could not.
In the years following World War II, people were looking for solutions that were more moderate and hopefully more stable than those provided by authoritarians in the decades prior. That led to the mass adoption of liberal democracy throughout the world, especially in Europe.
Even the information he sort of gets right is done so oversimplistically that the viewer's interpretation is not going to match the historical context. That's if it isn't likely to be a deliberate historical revision to give democratic socialism credit for many of the progressive wins that happened after World War II, which would be very gross because the reality is not really interesting this time, but dystopian, unfortunate, and most of all important. Fascism indeed ceased to be very relevant besides an attempt here and there, as tragic as a lot of them are even on their own. But if we're considering Marxism-Leninism authoritarian, then that also isn't true. The ideology only continued to grow as the Soviet Union had just helped liberate much of Eastern Europe, Mongolia, and China from Axis powers, and thus had a hand in the direction of those territories. But that isn't to say the same wasn't also true for America and the conveniently created World Bank, that indebted much of Western Europe and later many Third World countries who had to band together under the Non-Alignment Pact just to have a chance. Not to mention the very reasons there were the Korean and Vietnam Wars, the former half divided between American and Soviet influence against the people's initial wishes, and the latter maintained its self-determination through its victory against France and America and surviving beyond the collapse of the Soviet Union without much issue compared to the others. This is all to say that Ryan is given a very Western-centric view that discredits the reality of how complicated the times were during the Cold War, between Leninists and the Second International, the Trotskyist internationals, and the left communists criticizing the Soviets by the storm between France and Italy, and the CIA among the other bourgeois intelligence groups ruining things, and just how suppressed even social democracy was since the times of Nixon, Thatcher, and Reagan, but also especially after the USSR's collapse as the US sought to absorb the power vacuum to shoot for the top like on the leaderboard in Slytherio, to where we see the biggest spike in anti-democratic coups and violent wars that only became more subtle. So the workers weren't content after World War II, especially in the United States where many like to attribute FDR and his policies to the economic illusion of prosperity that got high off war reparations, indebted allies, and friends they forced along the way. His policies were in fact hardly different from the economic policies that many blamed Hoover for during the Great Depression, and why respectable social democrats like Huey Long's bullheaded push for social policies and an uplifting message to make every man a king had to exist.
The socialists that were content to work within that system were democratic socialists, and their influence led to the spread of socialist ideas throughout Europe. It was thought that if the government brought inequality under control, for example by providing housing, or healthcare, or mandating higher wages, that would make for a happier, and therefore more stable society. The views of liberals and socialists began to blur. It became normal for liberals to want some amount of welfare and regulated capitalism, and it became normal for socialists
to be okay with capitalism and some amount of income inequality.
So people generally started to think more in terms of compromise and moderation.
What I was saying all along, it was never about socialism. It was never about impartiality. It was never about demonstrating history for what it is, or presenting ideas for what they are. Ryan Chapman, who did a terrible job a year prior on his video What is Marxism, solved his ignorance, not by reading into it further to do it justice, but by confusing his viewers for the first 20 minutes with historical vibes as a distraction. Knowing that his assertions are nothing more than assertions, it's more likely to me that he is making a projection of what he would consider the ideal takeaway for his viewers, to take his understanding of socialism, see it as blurred with liberalism, and separate socialism from other socialists like how modern libertarians turned the term away from referring to anarchism. When it comes to understanding concepts like cooperation and compromise, you'll notice that these concepts are both relevant and often parallel between individual behavioral contexts like with psychology and more socio-political interactive contexts like with sociology. According to cultural anthropologist Reina Gattuso, compromise, like other kinds of cooperation, is ingrained in what it means to be human, reflecting our brain's bias towards cooperation. Psychologist Christopher Peterson, in his Virtue of Compromise, suggests that compromise in both the political and psychological sense is often weighed on moral grounds. The good sense of compromise is finding common ground with another, he begins. The bad sense is being untrue to your core values and beliefs, selling out to achieve some short-term goal. And in weighing the usefulness of any given compromise, as warned in Edward Ross's Social Psychology, compromise lessens the rancor of political conflicts, but it may postpone their settlement altogether. The need for cooperation at all, and particularly compromise, entails the presence of a conflict, yet not every conflict can be resolved, and even when things can be, there's often a lot of nuance around the corner to be comprehended in even trying, an effort that could be even skewed with the confirmation bias of assuming that such a method of resolution is even achievable or ideal at all, and why it's always best to put your eggs in more than one basket, so to speak, remaining open to both pragmatism, failure, and alternatives in navigating compromise and conviction. So be careful of compromises, and really consider for yourself what socialism should be to you, or you might find that you have become compromised yourself. This has been Reform or Socialism, an in-depth explanation. If you liked this video or learned something new, then leave a like. If you didn't, then leave a dislike. Subscribe for more content like this.
Goodbye.